Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being in the Public Safety Committee meeting today. We have one item on our agenda, which is the Bill 119, Police Officer Involved Death, Independent Investigation. It's obviously the three members of Public Safety are here, and we're also pleased to be joined by Councilmember Will Jawando. Will has the distinction of trying to be in two places at once today, so we understand if you have to leave, please, even though you're not a member of the committee, obviously we want to hear your discussions with it, and we will certainly give as much deference as we can so that you can try to jump back and forth. And with that, I guess Bob Drummer will lead us in the beginning. I'd like to invite the Assistant Police Chief, the Chief of Police, Tom Manger, to please join us. Assistant Police Chief Dave Anderson, and FOP President Tori Cook or some other FOP representative.
Just so you know, Bob and Susan have not seen the memo.
Okay. Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us. And Bob, if you can begin with us, please.
Good morning. Bill 119 is a bill that would require the executive to ensure that each police officer involved death has an independent investigation by a law enforcement office that is not a part of Montgomery County government. And it would require at least two independent investigators from another law enforcement office to investigate the incident and to make a written report, which would be provided to the state's attorney. And then if the state's attorney does not decide to file criminal charges against an officer, the report would then become public to the extent it's permitted under the Public Information Act, because we have no authority to change anything that might be confidential under the Public Information Act. The difference is, though, anything that would be a discretionary denial would then become not discretionary. It would become public. And there are parts of the Public Information Act that provides the custodian to have discretion whether to release something or not. Let me see. We had a public hearing. It was a lively public hearing with 20 speakers. Most of the speakers were supporting the bill. Police Chief Tom Manger also spoke, and although he spoke on behalf of himself, I believe, and the county executive, that he believed in transparency of these investigations and independence, but had some issues with the bill. And that's where we'll start today, I believe, with talking about the issues with the bill that I've identified and any others that have come up by other people may have identified. The first issue is, of course, the bill requires the executive to enter into an agreement with another law enforcement agency to conduct these investigations. As we all know, the county executive has authority to require the county to do something. The council certainly has the authority to require the executive to attempt to enter into an agreement, to solicit an agreement, to do anything like that. But the council doesn't have the authority to make the executive succeed, because you don't have authority over both parties. The only provision that I can think of in law that requires the parties to enter into an agreement is in collective bargaining. But in that situation, the legislature has jurisdiction and authority over both parties, both the executive, and the labor union. So, and in fact, they end up with an arbitration sometimes in the public sector, as we do, to resolve differences in the agreement. In this case, there's no the police chief or the county executive can't make another jurisdiction enter an agreement, you may want to hear from the police chief about attempts that have been made in the past to enter into an agreement. There is a line of cases in Maryland that say that if the legislature requires something, usually they're talking about the word shall, which in our code we use the word must, which is what's in this bill, that if there's no penalty for failure, it's really directory and not mandatory. But that leaves it kind of ambiguous. So I do have on page 3 a suggested amendment that would require the executive to make a good faith effort to ensure that an independent investigation is performed rather than to must ensure, which is probably closer to reality of what we can actually expect. But this may be a good time to hear from the chief about attempts to, and what the likelihood of entering into an agreement. Or I can move on to other issues, whatever you'd like, if you want to stop here and talk
Right.
about this one.
Please, Chief, good morning, and thank you for being here. See, you got a haircut for the day, so that's very impressive. Yes, go ahead.
Chief Tom Manger, the Montgomery County Police Department. Let me just, I just want to state for the record that I am fully supportive of independent investigations when they can be done, in an appropriate manner. I think that nearly 4 years ago, it was on June 9th, 2015, I sat before the county council and during a 2-hour hearing about police-community relations. And during that hearing, I said that I was in the process of trying to coordinate with other outside law enforcement agencies to assist us to conduct independent investigations of officer-involved shootings. So this is not something that I am dead set against. But I will tell you what happened back then. And my efforts were primarily with the Maryland State Police, because that's the model, and I'll say this again later on. The model that works is to have a State Bureau of Investigation conduct these, and that's in the places where this works and works well. It's because there's a State Bureau of Investigation that does them. Maryland State Police does not have the capability, the staffing, the resources, the ability to do these. That was the case back when I spoke with them in 2015. That remains the case. I spoke with a neighboring law enforcement agency which had the same capabilities that we do in terms of forensic ability, number of investigators, all those things. They would not agree to do those investigations. More recently, I spoke as recently as last week. I had a number of conversations with Chief Lisa Myers from the Howard County Police Department, and as recently as last week, she advised me that their county attorney had advised against getting into an agreement with Montgomery County, and she said that her major crimes investigations folks said that they do not have the capacity to do this investigation. So I have some thoughts about how we can get to where I think this bill wants to take us, because I'm certainly have no issues with independent investigations. But what my concerns are, as I have talked about before, is none of us, and I think that Mr. Juanda would agree with me, none of us want a deficient investigation, something less than what we get now. We want the best investigation that can be done. So my intent is try and get us there and give this, the investigation itself as much independent review, as much independence and oversight as we can possibly get without diminishing the effectiveness and the professionalism and the accuracy of the investigation itself.
Okay. Did you want to give your suggestions on how to get there, or?
I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that if
Please.
So what we have what I have been able to accomplish since 2015 is that our state's attorneys have reached an agreement, and we have cooperated with the Howard County State's Attorney, and that agreement, by the way, is being improved, I think, as we speak. I've had a chance to see the draft agreement, which I believe is going to be pretty close to the final agreement. And it would allow the Howard County State's Attorney, which, by the way, is a law enforcement agency, the Howard County State's Attorney's Office, which is a law enforcement agency, it would allow them to review our investigation, to conduct their own analysis, to conduct their own interviews, to re-interview folks, to get independent reports from the state medical examiner, from other forensic reports. They would have all of that information to rule on the lawfulness of a shooting. They would also obviously have the body-worn camera video, which since then, since 2015, I have, by practice, made available to the public once the criminal investigation has been completed. So I know the concept we're trying to get to here is increased public confidence, and I understand that, and I fully support that. My issue and my concern is legislating the mechanics of how an investigation is conducted. The mechanics as described in this bill are really unworkable and would result in deficient investigations. Two people, a great example of how Wisconsin does it is contained in the packet, and it gives a pretty comprehensive list of all of the things that needs to be done. And trying to do that with two investigators would be really unworkable. And so I think that no one has ever indicated, and I think in the packet, Mr. Giwando has stated publicly that in no way is this a reflection on the confidence that he has in the folks within Montgomery County doing these investigations. And I will also say that there's never been any concern or any voiced issue from anyone who's reviewed these investigations that there was even a hint of bias or lack of objectivity with the investigations that were done. We are, in fact, a neutral fact finder. And the Howard County State's Attorney can review, analyze every aspect of our investigation. They can re-interview witnesses, redo things that they would think need to be redone, and they can, in fact, send the case to a grand jury for a further investigative review. So I think that continuing to work with the Howard County State's Attorney, making sure that in the agreement that the state's attorneys have, it gives them the capability to conduct their independent investigation, but does not impact the mechanics of timely response to a scene, timely investigations, the ability to get witnesses before they leave, to recover evidence before it's destroyed. All of those things which are crucial to an accurate and complete investigation, and that's what, as a police chief, I'm responsible for making sure that those things occur, and I want to make sure they continue to occur, but also give that independent look, an independent review, and in fact, independent ability for an independent investigation done by the Howard County State's Attorney, which again is a law enforcement agency.
Well, I think it's Will's light. I can't tell whose light is on. Please, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, there was. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. There's a lot there, so I guess I'll start where we started with in the packet, the issue of shall or must, rather, than make best efforts, or that was suggested. You know, I think, as I sent into my memo that came to you pretty early this morning, like 20 minutes ago, the point of the bill is, again, to guard against the actual or perception of bias. And as I've stated many, many times since we introduced this in January, it was based on a recommendation from President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force that calls for both independent prosecutions and independent police investigations, which are two separate things. They kind of were conflated, I think, a little bit in Chief Manger's remarks. They're two different components of and so we separated out the independent police investigation in this, which is currently not happening. We have had this informal agreement with Howard County, which will now be formalized, which is a great step.
State's attorney.
from the state, on the state's attorney side, which obviously is different, which is more of a review, and of course, people can go back, as with any review of an investigation, and go back and look at different things. But this is really from the inception of the investigation. And as Bob mentioned, I think the core of the bill is that we want to make sure that we are putting as much pressure and incentive on the executive to go out and form one of these agreements, whether it be with a federal partner, a state partner, or a local jurisdiction. And I know we've made some efforts, as Chief Major mentioned, in the past years. I think we're in a different day and time right now, and I think there are other willing people that would be interested in partnering with us, but we shouldn't preclude those efforts. I think we want to keep the pressure on to do those. And so I see it as a weakening if you were to put in this language of make best efforts. And to the legal point that Mr. Drummond said, if the executive needs more time, if he's not able to find it, there's no penalty in the law. And so I think we want to send a strong message that this is the intent of what we want to see happen. So on that point, I'll say that. You know, a lot of the things, I think good policy doesn't get into the weeds on the actual administration and implementation. And if you look, I provided, you saw in the packet what Wisconsin developed, and this was years after the law was passed, which is, I think, is a key point. They developed a very thorough kind of analysis of what should happen in the state in the case of these investigations. And Wisconsin's a big state. Something happens. Who deploys to the scene? Who are the lead investigators? How does it all happen? It's all in your 38 through 72, those long pages. That did not happen. That did not accompany the bill when it was passed. Our job is to pass policy. The executive side and the implementation of that and the regulation side, their job is to do that. And so I think that's a key distinction that's being missed here and kind of conflated. It's almost like, oh, this is hard. You know, we might not be able to find someone. It's too hard to do, so don't do it. And I think that's not our proper role as policymakers. I think we take what the right thing to do, what the right policy is, and we push it forward. So I would just say that the last thing I'll say, and I guess ask a question, is, you know, the distinction between a review and an investigation. You know, Howard County State's Attorney is reviewing an investigation of our police officers. The whole core of this bill, or at least the first part, has two parts: the independent police investigation and the public reporting. A core part of it is that our police are not leading the investigation into the death of a resident that they are responsible for or involved in. And so that's a key distinction here, and I think that's what, if we were to change that, we're just basically changing the whole bill and not having it have any utility. I guess we haven't heard from our police union. Tori, do you have anything to add on where you all are on this bill?
We're also not against.
You should identify yourself.
Oh,
We all know who you are. But please.
Tory Cook, Fraternal Police Lodge 35. We are the union for Montgomery County police officers. We're not against the bill. We believe in transparency. We also don't get into the mechanics of how an investigation is done on the police department's part. I have been an investigator. I know how difficult it is to investigate crimes and how difficult it is to be able to respond to scenes and those type of things when you're from a distance. So we're talking about having another police agency investigate a incident that occurs within Montgomery County. And there are certain things that have to be analyzed, I would say, from a standpoint of a police department that's going to allow this or that's going to have an agreement for this. And that's up to the police chief. That's up to those that are under the purview of the police chief. And I would say that from my standpoint, could it be worked out? It's done in other areas, but is it going to take time? Yes, it is. does another agency want to do it? I'm not sure that other agencies want to get involved in having to switch manpower to be available to respond to these things. And that's why in most states that you have it, you have a state bureau of investigation that investigates these. And a lot of those agencies, or states, I would say, do it because the smaller agencies don't have the ability to investigate these type of shootings, where the larger police departments, which Montgomery County is, Prince George's County is, Howard County is, they have the ability to investigate these type of shootings. I'm invested in transparency. The facts are going to bear out the way the facts bear out. They're not going to change regardless of who does these investigations. And it's no different than what's done for the citizens of Montgomery County. We investigate to the fullest for them, and we investigate to the fullest for that police officer who gets involved in something, who is called upon to use force. So as far as logistics, I would say it's going to be difficult for two agencies to get together and provide logistics for getting to certain shootings. We know Montgomery County. Howard County doesn't know Montgomery County. There would have to be some type of agreement and some type of specific logic behind this. But I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm saying it's going to be difficult, but that's not my job. So.
And if I could just add one other thing.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. And the point was made, if we had a lively, I think Bob described it as lively public testimony, 99% in favor of the bill, or maybe my percentages are off. And there are many amendments that were suggested to be offered that include civilians being involved in the investigations, that expand the independent investigation to serious bodily injury and other. So I think the point that I'm making there is that there are a lot of people that want to see these types of independent investigations and help restore. We heard from a young man his testimony is in here, a high school student, African-American young student, who talked about his experience with racial profiling. And I think we need to send a strong message that, yes, we're for independence and we're for transparency. And I'm glad to hear you say that, Chief. I hadn't heard you say the independent investigation part 100% until today, but I'm glad. And I think, look, I've spoken to other county executives. I've spoken to the Attorney General who's interested. I think statewide option is the best option down the line. But I think, like we do in many areas here in Montgomery County, we can lead and show how it can be done in a cooperative way. When in Wisconsin, with the independent entity they set up in the local jurisdiction, there are a myriad. That whole document is about what needs to happen between those two law enforcement agencies to have this work properly. So no matter, similarly with the Howard County State's Attorney, the MOU that was informal, I find it, we were kind of winging it for a couple of years. I didn't know there was anything on paper. That's kind of scary, but I'm glad now there will be something on paper on the criminal prosecution agreement between Howard County and Montgomery County, and that's good. You're going to have to work out those details, and that the policy was decided by John McCarthy, said this is a good thing, and worked with you all, and now they're working out the details of that agreement. We need to say with a strong voice that independent police investigations and independent prosecutions are a priority for us. And if we believe that, we're going to figure out the details. Now, if there are things that are going to come up in that process, and we'll deal with them, but I think we have to say that in a strong way. And then the last thing I will say, or in this point, we have to find a willing partner. We're also taking on their burden, right? So it's a fair exchange, right? And if Howard County's not going to do it, that's fine. My understanding from talking to County Executive Ball last week was that it was more of a cost issue. They were worried about us having more than they would, and they're willing to keep talking. I've also spoke to Prince George's County and Baltimore County, and there's other people who are interested. Again, I've spoke to the Attorney General as well, and that's not out of the question. So I think we want to kick the tires. We want to allow the executive to go and see who can help work with us on this, and push it forward, because the principle of independence is important. So I'll pause there because I know my colleagues probably have a question.
Well, and thank you for all your points. I guess one of the things that, for the, as an example, and I don't know for sure, but it's my understanding for the Attorney General, that the Attorney General doesn't have his own criminal investigators. He uses the state police, from what I understand. I don't know how correct that is, but that's what I've heard. And so I don't know whether or not asking an Attorney General, my point being, asking an Attorney General means that they're going to have to come up with a whole new division, which is going to take some time to do that. And obviously, with this bill, and as far as I'm concerned, this bill should pass. But what we're asking for this bill is that something happen fairly rapidly, or as rapid as it could possibly happen. Now, if you ask, and we're saying, always say Howard County, I mean, it might not be Howard County, but if we ask Howard County to do it, and Howard County says they're not going to do it, and we still want this bill to go into effect, we have to have some kind of a plan that's actually going to let this bill go into effect. And at this point, I don't know that we have an agency that would do it, and you certainly want, as you suggested, Prince George's. Well, Prince George's would cause they have a lot more excitement in Prince George's than we have in Montgomery County, and it would take tremendous manpower if personnel to work with them if we were doing as an agency that would investigate them if they would want it. I mean, I don't know that every county wants an independent investigator to come in. I mean, if it was state law, then obviously that would cause it. So I think we have to, I keep looking at it and saying, look, we want the practical side. We want this to be done as quickly as it possibly can, and so that somebody doesn't say, well, you're violating your own law. Nobody wants to do that either. But Chief, my greatest concern, or there's concerns, but my greatest concern is we need to work through what actually happens when this type of horrific tragedy takes place. Someone has just been shot and may be killed. I mean, when someone gets shot, I mean, you don't know whether they're still living or not. And so our police, the police officer and people on the scene would have to, I would assume, I've never been there, thank goodness, and hopefully we'll never have another one of these so that no one is ever there. But I would assume that the police themselves must run to the person who was just shot to make sure whether, A, they're still living, and if they are still living, that you call ambulances and helicopters and everything else that needs to be done. And then you need to figure out whether or not, as an example, for the bank robbery that happened a couple months ago now, you need to figure out whether anybody else was involved, whether or not there's still somebody inside that bank, whether or not you need all of these things to take place in a very short period of time. There's a lot of chaos, obviously. And so can you walk us through how something like that would happen? And then when would you call in that independent agency in? What happens when you call them in? Does that mean everything stops? I mean, you have to figure out the community has to be safe. If somebody's out in that community with a gun that was also had run away, you have to make certain that we're notified that the community remains safe. Please.
When an incident like this happens, there's a number of things, in fact, many things that go on simultaneously. The officers are required to administer first aid to anybody who's injured, including someone who's been shot. There immediately is the necessity to identify and get information from witnesses. And when you have something like this that happens out in the public, you have people who are on the street who see these things. You want to hold on to those folks so that you can get their information, so that you can talk to them, get information about what they observed. This is crucial to any investigation, because when you talk about the independent investigation and you want to have transparency and objectivity, a witness who is on the street and sees this hopefully is an objective observer. And so you want to make sure you get what they have to say. There's evidence that, ballistic evidence, could be blood evidence, forensic evidence, that needs to be collected in a timely fashion, because you don't want that to be destroyed by weather, by time, by people going through a scene. And so it's important that you have the ability to have a timely response from forensic investigators, from major crimes detectives who are going to be talking to the witnesses, identifying the witnesses. And then, as you point out, there is always the additional responsibilities to the victims. In the case of that bank robbery, we had to go to the bank, we had to talk to the bank manager, we had to talk to the folks that were there, and it requires a team of investigators. In that case, in Silver Spring a few months ago, I counted at least 10 or 12 investigators that were on the scene to get, and again, in the packet, the list of all the things that you need to do from the Wisconsin agreement, very good, very comprehensive, but it gives you an idea of just the myriad of things and the capacity you need to do an investigation appropriately. While I think, again, there is agreement that that the transparency, accountability, and the independence of an investigation are worthy goals. The fact is that we can't just gloss by the fact that we don't have an agreement, and there really isn't much will out there to get an agreement from all the work that I've done over the past 4 years. And you can't just say, well, you know, it'll work out, because that's the very crux of this bill, is to have that agreement in place. And where this type of outside independent investigation works is where you have a state agency in Wisconsin, in Georgia, and in a number of other states where they have state bureaus of investigation. That's where it works. That's what we need. That's where we should be putting our efforts. And I believe there's a state bill that is being considered. I don't know what the status of that bill is. I'm thinking that it's probably not going to pass this session, but that would have been the solution, I think, to the issue that we're trying to resolve. There's a lot of other things in this bill that I think are good, that the public reports about how an agency who did the independent investigation, the steps they took, the facts they gathered, the analysis of evidence, their legal reasoning, and then any other questions associated with the conclusion of the case. If this information is made public, I think all of us want that. And that can be done whether they're reviewing an investigation or whether they're conducting the investigation. Who conducts that investigation is not something we can just cross our fingers and say, let's hope we can get it done. It has to be done. It has to be something that is required. That can't be, after we get an agreement with somebody and they decide after about a year, hey, this is not worth it for us. We can't do it. We can't afford it. Whatever they decide, and they just break away from the agreement. It has to be something that is in place and ironclad, and we don't have that yet. And unless and until we do have it, we can't just gloss over the fact that, well, it's a worthy goal, which it is. But I'm the one that's responsible for doing these in criminal investigations. You heard it from the president of the FOP. There's no question that I am the one, that the police chief is the person who's responsible for conducting these investigations. And I can't just hope that somebody else is going to do it as well as it needs to be done. I have to ensure that it's done properly. And I think that I can ensure that it's done properly and still get the independent review. And in fact, if there's questions about the investigation that was done, they can reinvestigate. They can conduct their own investigation in any aspect of the case where they feel it needs to be done. I think that gets us to where where we need to be.
Go ahead, Will.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The assumption here is that you're basically saying do nothing, right, from the county council.
I was not saying that.
No, sir.
In regards to this bill, at the county level, you're
No,
saying
sir.
don't.
I think there's a few amendments.
On the independent investigation side. I'm trying to understand, because excuse me if that's not what I
I'm
don't want to
saying
put words
that
in your
Howard
mouth, that's what
County
I'm
State's
hearing.
attorney can conduct an independent investigation.
So on the independent police investigation, you're saying that this is not workable?
I'm saying.
Because you don't know who
well,
the
if you have a
partner is
sta-
today.
If you have a state agency or any agency that has the resources and the staffing to do it, then it would work.
Okay, and this.
Right now, we don't have that, other than our own police.
This directs us to seek that out. That's what the bill does. It seeks out qualified investigators from an independent police agency, federal, state, or local. I know a few years ago you made some attempts, and I know you spoke to Howard County. I have some questions about in how you spoke to Howard County because
What are those questions, Mr. Jawando?
because
I'm happy to answer.
what I've heard is that it was not encouraging of the bill, and the meetings I've had with you on this bill have not been encouraging on this point, on the independent police investigation point.
Because I'm responsible for getting these investigations done, and
And that's
we
the whole
can't-
point. That the point of the bill is to not have you be responsible for doing the investigation when your officer is involved in the killing of a resident. That's the whole point of the bill. And if you've stated it, I understand you have a fundamental problem with that issue. And it seems like you're saying both sides here.
No, sir, I've been very clear, and this is the second time that you've accused me of giving conflicting information, and that is not the case. I am very clear that there is nothing wrong with transparency, accountability, and an independent investigation. We just can't say, let's do it without having a mechanism to get it done and done appropriately.
Agreed. And this bill directs the executive to seek out a federal, state, or
Seeking it
local
out,
partner.
seeking
to
it out
set up
and
that
getting it
agreement.
done are two different things.
Of course. But that's what, if we have to revisit, if we're not able to find a partner a year down the line, then we revisit it. But the goal of the policy, and I think we will. And like I said, I have other conversations with other neighboring jurisdictions outside of Howard County who are interested. And I think we have the opportunity to do it here. And just like in Wisconsin, I know it's a state, but they have to do everything that we're going to have to do. John McCarthy has to set up an MOU with Howard County just to do the review on the prosecutorial side. Those things are hard. They're going to need to happen. It's not easy, but it's the right thing to do, and we need to embark upon it here in Montgomery County. That's what we're trying to do. I'm not saying it's easy, and I understand it's complicated. And even in Wisconsin, the two investigator language comes from their bill because they have two lead investigators in addition to the involved police agency. It's not saying the involved police agency, something happens, they run away from the scene. They secure the scene, they may even collect some initial evidence, but they are not leading the investigation. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Let me just jump in. First off, we're still on the first point, which is discussing whether or not we can get to the point of how we would say that the county executive, to require the county executive to try to get an outside agency to work on this. And I understand your point, Councilmember Jawando, but the reality is that we can require a county executive to try his best, whatever way we say it, to try to get an outside agency to do it. And there's, more things than just trying to get the outside agency. The other county has to have a budget for it and all of those necessary things. They have to have people involved in it. But if that good faith effort, and the words good and faith effort are being said here, if it doesn't work, then what do? And we don't want somebody to say that we're violating our own law by not getting this done. So it puts us in a little bit of a concern. And if the terms, and I understand what you're saying, if the terms good faith effort, if we made that more transparent, if we said that we require the executive must make a good faith effort, which is the suggestion here, if we made that clearer, that said that would be more transparent, that we would be told, that the community would be told who they contacted and who turned them down and all of those sorts of things, would that in some way, I mean, if somebody's really trying their best and they can't do it, that's one thing. It's somebody else, it's another thing that's saying, well, we tried and it failed. I mean, there's a difference. So are you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mr. Chair, and constructive as always. Yes, I envisioned that's the way the bill would work. The executive would go make every effort, and that's why I wanted to keep the language strong. He'd go, again, want to emphasize federal, state, and local. So, and if they've said no before, that doesn't mean they're going to say no again. There's new people in all these roles in many cases. He really works hard, and we can work with him to investigate all those options, document those. If he comes back and says, hey, no one is willing to do this, then we might have to make, one, there's no penalty, so I don't think there's.
But
you
there
know,
is a
but
penalty
we
to the
could-
public.
Sure,
You're
sure,
not-
sure.
you're not following the
Sure.
rules.
So we could say at the end, I'd be happy to put, if you wanted to put in there, in that scenario, current practice is what's gonna happen, because obviously, during that process, if someone unfortunately is killed, the current practice will happen. You know, we'll still keep investigating the way we are. But, you know, I think documenting it would be important.
If I can, real quick.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
please, and then we're gonna-
Assistant Chief Dave Anderson with the County Police. I want to make sure everybody understands, just to a point that you were trying to make, Councilmember Jawando, about the fact that a prosecutor's office doesn't lead an investigation. They actually do. The mechanics of this, again, are we will gather information, whatever the case may be, but especially when it lies in circuit court, what will happen is there'll be a conference, state's attorney's conference. And what we do is we sit down with their lead prosecutor typically. In these cases, it'll more than likely be more than one person. We'll explain the case, the evidence that we have, and in these cases, it's an ongoing dialogue. And if there are things that they believe need to be revisited or visited for a first time, if they think, you know, there's a witness out there that they were unaware of and now they're aware of it, or something, anything like that, they will direct the investigators to go back out. They also have their own investigators as well that they will send out. And so it's not uncommon for a prosecutor to be looking at the merits of a case and saying, you know what, if I believe that there is additional information that I need, then I'm going to instruct the investigators to follow up on that because I need to understand all the facts of what's actually occurring.
Thank you. I have no idea who was first, but we're going to say you're first, so.
Tom's first.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
These guys.
I guess I have looking for suggestions from Mr. Drummer on this matter to get us past the first point. I understand Councilmember Jawando's imperative that we put pressure on the executive to do the best job executing this that he can. And philosophically, I mean, on many other issues, I'm very comfortable with strong requirements on executive branch agencies. But this is a little different than other ones because it requires two willing partners to enter into an agreement voluntarily, only one of which we can really control. But I understand what you're saying about good faith effort might be feel too murky and provide an off-ramp that's too easily accessed. In other areas of law, though, we put contingencies into the bill where we say, here's the requirement, and if the requirement cannot be met by a certain time, here's what happens. You know, in procurement, we say this is the requirement, but if you don't find a competent bidder, here's what goes. Couldn't we include language that says, in the event the executive cannot find after a year or by January 1st, 2020, or whatever date we push it to, then these things happen. He reports back to the county council. He reports on which other jurisdictions were approached, what their objections were, how those were addressed if they were, and comes back to the council for some type of reconsideration or contingency.
Yeah, we could add language after the sentence of the executive must ensure that an independent investigation is performed. Say the executive, well, we could change it to the executive must attempt to enter into an agreement with another law enforcement agency to ensure that an independent investigation is done, and then put a sentence in if the executive is unable to, by the effective date, or whatever date you put, must submit a report to the council explaining, you know, what agencies that were contacted and
Elaborate on and update all the work Chief Manger's done in the past and give us some comfort that it wasn't just, okay, sure, trust me,
we could
there's a
write
good
something
faith
like
effort,
that.
and we were unsuccessful. But who was contacted, at which time, what their objections were, if the objections were financial, and there's just a question of the reimbursement thing, that could be addressed. Other things, I have other kind of logistical questions about the bill and the investigations, but it seems like providing a more detailed off-ramp would maybe give, I'm guessing, you more comfort and the rest of us.
Okay.
I mean, I would put that probably in an uncodified section, is section 2, to say, notwithstanding the bill, that if the executive's unable to, or notwithstanding,
Yeah.
is unable to, yes, must report to the council on or before such date, submit a report and put in some bare bones is what should be in the report. That's where I would put it, rather than have it sitting in your law forever and ever. If
Right.
you have an agreement, then you got something sitting in the law that, in the codification, that says, well, if he doesn't have an agreement when there is an agreement.
You're giving us a progress report. Require DHC
Although
and planning.
there is the possibility you enter into an agreement and then it falls apart. It works for a year or two and then it's gone. And but
It triggers some
Work
kind of
with that,
requirement for the
you know.
council to reconsider
Yeah.
things, rather than just,
Or to
okay,
rewrite it.
it was a good idea.
well, I think it would make it clear that that's the penalty essentially for not entering into an agreement. It's not, I wouldn't call that a penalty, but that's what's supposed to happen if you don't enter into an agreement, and would probably make it clearer that it's directory and not mandatory, rather than the language I suggested. Yeah, we could do that.
How do you guys feel about that? Chief?
That's fine. Mr. John Doe, despite what you heard, I was not discouraging when I spoke. I was hoping for an agreement with Howard County. And I think the reasons they gave had nothing to do with my efforts to get it done. And because I was trying to get it done 4 years ago, and still was trying to get it done a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago when this first came out. Please know that that's true. So again, I'm just, until we have an agreement in place and until we can ensure that this is done in a timely fashion and nothing gets, there's no diminishing of the effectiveness of the investigation. Because I'm responsible for this, I just want to make sure all that stuff is covered.
Can I ask, Will, and Dave, and then get back to you? Yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead, on this point. Yeah.
Actually, Councilmember Harker went exactly where I was hoping we would go. I think that is an excellent recommendation. I know that, I don't believe there's anybody here from the second floor, so I'm not sure how the county executive,
being
the county executive's office, so, and Chief Manger, you of course will be retiring very soon, and so we will have a very new police chief on the horizon, so I'd be curious to hear from the county executive how they intend to approach this, what strategy will they be using to seek the kind of partnership which clearly has to go both ways. And there's an acknowledgement that the best practice is at the state level, which is beyond all of our control. And I think as a practice, it would make sense for the state to pursue this effort, because then it would benefit more than just Montgomery County, but police-involved shootings across the entire state. And so I think moving forward, seeking some feedback or input from the entities that we're trying to enter agreements into will help inform our strategy and where we need to apply pressure, whether through the Maryland Association of Counties, whether through other entities that are out there that we can lean on that have more leverage than we do just independently as a county. But the movement that has been sparked here by Councilmember Jawando's bill, and I do want to acknowledge Councilmember Jawando and appreciate your leadership. We've both gotten emotional talking about our own families and the world that we're raising our kids in today. We very much feel like we're at a crossroads. I think that the advent of cell phones and that we've got cameras right in our back pockets, and the advent of body-worn cameras have brought to light what many of people in our minority communities have known for a long time, that there is a problem here. And while I acknowledge how incredible our police force here is in Montgomery County and how complex this work is, and I so appreciate your comments, Chief Manger, about wanting to ensure transparency and move that forward and using whatever tools we have at our disposal to be able to reasonably and responsibly do that, I think is such a critically important message, particularly in today's day and time. This council is going to be focusing a lot of its policy efforts over the next year and really the next 4 years from a racial equity lens. And that is critically important. I also do want to mention, though, that about a month ago, I had the opportunity to go into the ceremony for the installation of our most recent police academy class. And I got there a little late. And so I sat next to, I didn't sit where I was supposed to sit, but I'm so glad that it worked out the way that it did, because I sat next to the wife of one of the academy graduates and who was holding a 2-month-old baby. And I had the opportunity to talk to her on a personal level, and I could see the pride in her face, but I could also see the trepidation and the nervousness that she felt, that her husband was going into this critically important work, but putting himself clearly at risk. So there obviously is a balance here on every conceivable level, and I've had the opportunity as a former department head to work directly with our law enforcement on youth development issues, on making sure that we keep our more vulnerable populations safe, particularly our senior citizens. So this bill is so important because it continues to advance the leadership that we've had for so many decades here in our county, but that sometimes we take for granted. But obviously, we want to make sure we put ourselves in the best position to succeed. So I would like to hear more from our executive branch regarding what efforts they will enact to achieve some sort of an agreement that will make sense for all parties involved. I also want to make sure that we don't have the unintended consequence of creating more problems than we're trying to solve, because we want to make sure that there is total transparency in whoever this entity will be, and that they be held accountable to our constituents here in Montgomery County in the way that we would expect our police chief to be held accountable, and not just from the investigative standpoint, but from the communication standpoint, from the beginning of the investigation till the end of the investigation. And so I think that will be important language in any sort of agreement that we include as well.
And we're going to get right back to you, but on the first point, also, to me, we should also ask, though we can say, get back to us, after the year if you failed. I believe that we should get updates every quarter, every whatever, so that we understand what we're trying, or what the county executive is trying, and so that everyone is aware of it. I mean, obviously, I think monthly happens too quickly, but I think quarterly would be fair. And may be able to take a slower amount of time for them to try to reach other agencies and discuss it. But I think that would be something that's fair. Well, go ahead. And then we're getting back to you.
Just on this
Cut you
point,
off. I'm sorry.
before we leave this point, and I know Tom
Yeah.
wants to go further. Bob, I think it's important, I just want to make sure we're clear. We're not changing the initial language. It's because it's going to say must, and we're putting something in the secondary, not around these points. I just think that's important, because I heard you maybe change the initial language in what you said. It might have been an accident because we're just kind of going back and forth, but.
Well, this is saying must make, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask the exact same question to just make sure we understood where we were. Do you want to keep the language must ensure as it is, and then put something in the uncodified section to say what happens if he's unable to enter into an agreement?
Well, I think the way that you've written, or your suggested writing, the executive must make a good faith effort. And then if we put it there, and then all the qualifiers and everything else he's trying to do, I don't see, well, and I'm cutting you off, and that's not fair. Go ahead.
No, you're the chairman.
Well, but I know, but a good chairman allows people to speak. But I'm concerned that we are requiring somebody to do something that they might not have the authority to do. And I don't want the public to think that if they didn't do it, that they're violating law. In good faith, they tried to do it, and it just didn't work. We still have to have, if one of these horrible situations happens, we still have to have that horrible situation investigated. We have to make certain that we're being as transparent as we possibly can, even if it's Montgomery County doing it. And have the state's attorney from another jurisdiction consider whether there should be charges. But I don't want anyone to believe that what we're trying to do is not anything that if we try to do it in good faith and we can't do it, then we're not trying to do it in good faith. That's my biggest point.
In that our investigations are suspect.
In our investigation, or suspect, right.
I mean, I think my language, the good faith efforts, is consistent with Tom's suggestion, to put in language about what happens if not. But you could do it either way. I think it.
Write up a couple scenarios, please, or a scenario, your suggested scenario from what we're saying here. And then we're not going to be able to do something today on that, but so that we can at least move on with this. It's obviously a very important point, but every other point that we're going to be discussing is a very important point too, and I'd like to move that along as best I can. But I'd also like to get back to Councilmember Hucker, please. Okay.
I had a couple, follow-up questions on other matters. I guess, just, Chief, I've also talked to the OAG about their capacity on this, and they're looking into that. Chief, you said you looked into you've spoken to the Maryland State Police recently?
Not recently.
Not recently.
4 years.
Was that, okay. And that you said they don't have the capacity. Does the Wisconsin State Police has greater capacity than they have?
Actually, I think it's, I'm not sure, I don't know whether it's part of the state police. They talked about the Wisconsin.
DCI.
Yeah, Division of Criminal Investigations. So I don't know if that's part of the state police or not. I don't know.
Okay.
But Georgia has.
Georgia has a Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which again, I don't believe is part of the state patrol or state police that they have.
It's an independent agency of Georgia.
Independent state agency.
Yeah.
Okay. And then also, I remember some of your logistical questions you've brought up at the hearing and other things. I'm curious about that. So in Wisconsin, and I'm not, the checklist and everything in the packet is very helpful, but I was still left with a couple of questions. So the agreement means that in the event of an officer-involved shooting, this protocol kicks in right away. Nobody has to make a separate decision to call them in. But then who secures the scene, and how long does it take? Wisconsin's a big place.
I don't know in terms of Wisconsin.
Okay.
I think here, and I think based on conversations I've had with Councilmember Joando, that we would still secure the scene and have an initial response and secure the scene.
And then wait for the other jurisdictions' investigatory.
Well, that's
to be
not
negotiated.
worked out yet.
Yes, right. Do you understand how Wisconsin, can you comment on that?
Yeah, my understanding, and I know it's a lot of pages here, is that yes, of course, incident happens, you have to have the scene secured, and then the call is made out to the other investigators, similar to, might take a little longer, but you would, if a police officer, patrols officer is involved, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you'd have to call the homicide detectives and people who might not already be there to come and process that scene, right? So maybe we're talking about probably a distance in time might be a little longer, but someone's going to have to. So yes, that has to happen. You have to preserve the scene. And my understanding from reading through this as well is that that's what happens. You contact them, they respond, they collaborate with the people who are on. I'm literally reading from the thing here. Who's on the scene? The law enforcement agency that's involved, and then several things happen. So I think it's important to realize too, for all my council members and the public, that even if it was a state entity, all this still needs to be worked out. All these logistical challenges that we're talking about, they might even be greater if you're coming from further away. And so it has to happen, and they're going to be different based on the local jurisdiction. The sheriff's department in Wacomico County might not want to do things exactly the way the Montgomery County wants to do in interaction with the state agency. So there's just, I don't want to get caught up. They're important questions, but again, they're going to have to be figured out either way. And I think we'll actually be ahead of the game if we can start figuring them out now. So I went a little broader than your initial question, but that's my understanding, is that the involved police agency is involved with the initial securing of the scene and even collecting of some evidence. And again, that's all worked out in an MOU that our executive and police chief incoming would need to work out with whomever we do the agreement with.
Okay. Are we okay to move forward off of number one? Are you fairly clear on what we're trying to do? I know you're gonna have to give us some suggested language and run it past us, but it's an important point, obviously, and we don't want anybody not to have it as best we can have it, so.
Right, I'm going to put together a couple of alternatives, one leaving the word must in there and one taking it out for the committee to consider, changing it to some sort of good faith efforts. And
Are you
anything
all
else
right
I
with
might think
that?
of in the interim?
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
I know
sure.
I'm on the committee. I just would say, I think if we're going to add that off-ramp, which I think is a good idea, of what happens if you're not able to secure an agreement, I would say that it would seem to make sense to me to just leave the language as must. That's what we're expecting. If you can't do it, here's what happens. And I think that's hopefully accomplishes both.
I hear you loud and clear. Let's see the suggested language. I have a feeling you'll be visiting with us again, and we can get past this. But as I say, we're all the way past number one on this list, so, yeah. So the next point is should the investigation be performed by civilians? And then,
Yeah, that was brought up in the testimony of several people in the public hearing. And while I understand that has a certain air of independence to it that makes some people feel better, I think all in all, I don't recommend it because I don't think that the civilians are going to be able to do it a complete and proper investigation. I think it's not something you just grab somebody off the street who happens to be very knowledgeable and independent, but may not know exactly how to deal with the evidence and witnesses. So I don't recommend that. I haven't seen that done elsewhere per se. And then there's the added problem. I'm not sure if a civilian investigation could be used ultimately by the state's attorney that might be a question for the state's attorney, but whether they could actually use that for the criminal prosecution, for an attempted criminal prosecution. I think it's not what they're used to. They wouldn't be able to direct them, and they may have some issues with that.
okay. Any discussion on this topic?
I can make one quick.
Go ahead, please.
Just one quick point. I don't disagree. I think these are complex investigations. You need equipment, you need crime scene, you need training, you need a lot of things that I'm sure the police and union reps could talk about. But it comes from a place of, I think it's important to note that many people are concerned that having police involved at all in the investigation of shooting that their agency is involved in is in and of itself not independent. And I just want to acknowledge that, and I understand that. And we heard it from several people, and so I don't want to cursory go over it, that it is a legitimate concern, but I think practically it's not proper in this context to do that. And I just wanted to speak for the people who can't speak today that I know feel that way.
And I appreciate that, though I do believe that, I think first of all, it's tough enough for us to try to get an independent agency to do this. I mean, to try to get people who are civilians who have to be trained, who have to do all of these other things. I think from a practical standpoint, let's try to get an agency first and then see how that works out. I don't know where you two gentlemen are.
I agree. Certainly in principle, you can understand the concern, but in practice, I'm not sure that it gets us far enough along to be able to not impede the investigation. So, and I think there are other efforts currently underway to look at enhancing civilian participation in overall police practices that, while not specific to these types of investigations, overall get at the heart of creating more of a partnership and alliance and transparency.
You good?
Mr. Katz, if I
Yes,
can,
please.
just real quick, under B, the one thing that is not noted is that they're sworn investigators.
Okay. So, Mr. Drummer, did you make note of that?
Let me just make sure I know what you're talking about. Which line are you talking
If
about?
you look at B, last sentence, the independent investigation must be performed by at least 2 independent investigators. It doesn't define that they're sworn law enforcement investigators.
Wouldn't the fact that they're from a law enforcement agency take care of that, or no?
I mean, we have background folks that are civilians. I mean, we have lots of civilian folks that work for us. It's just,
Okay.
I think if that's the intent.
Yeah,
we might be
the
able to-
belt and suspender approach. I mean, if it's implied, let's put it in, you know.
Okay.
Sure. Trying to figure out where to put it, but.
Right. Okay, are we all right on that one?
Could I ask one question to the chief?
But sure.
Or, to our law enforcement partners, are you aware, some of the folks we met with in the course of this bill over the last several months who had been in the county for a long time, I'm thinking of Ms. Tina as one, mentioned a program where, under Doug Duncan, when there was a death or serious incident with police, that there were civilian observers that were sent a page, you know, this is, tells you when it happened, they were talking about pagers, but that, and then that they would come to the scene, not to participate in the investigation, but to observe what was happening. Have any of you heard of that? I haven't been able to verify it, I wanted to ask since we had you here.
I've not, but with the advent of cell phone cameras,
And body-worn cameras,
in
yeah.
essence, there's always quite a few eyes on the investigation at the scene.
So you had-
All right, so are we okay on number 2? And Bob, you're going to work on adding the word sworn somewhere.
Yeah, I think I would add it, actually, I can tell you now. In line 15 of the bill, it would say the independent investigation must be performed by at least 2 sworn independent investigators.
Okay, all right. All right, so next, you know, I did want to point out that some of the literature that I read is from the city of Madison, Wisconsin, for their procedures. And I thought it was neat that years ago, a Montgomery County police officer actually was the chief of Madison, Wisconsin, a former Montgomery County police officer. So obviously, he wasn't there when this came up, but we certainly we've had people work throughout the United States. So the third point that was raised is, should the bill be amended to include all excessive force complaints about police officers? First off, can you explain, I don't know, is there a definition of the word excessive force? Do we have a definition of that?
It would be more force than is reasonably necessary to take a person into custody.
So right now, and I met with a couple of groups, obviously, just like everybody else has, but somebody said, if right now, if somebody broke a leg or legs or whatever, does the police themselves investigate that? Is that by complaint? How is that handled?
Those complaints come from a variety of sources, and most excessive force complaints come from within the department. They're self-initiated by the department. We also do get a few complaints of excessive force from people who themselves believe they're the victim of excessive force. There's 2 things that are done. There's 2 investigations. The first is a criminal investigation, because if an officer has committed an assault or some criminal violation, that's what we look at first. Those are all sent to the state's attorney for review and a decision by the state's attorney. Once that criminal investigation is completed, an administrative or internal investigation is done.
Okay. And Bob, you suggested that we not amend the bill to include excessive force.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just, we're going to have enough trouble trying to find a partner for officer-involved deaths and excessive force complaints. I mean, I started my career defending Prince George's County police officers and excessive force complaints, and they range from somebody who's seriously injured to somebody, who just, thought that he put the handcuffs on too hard, and had an injury from the handcuffs. And I just think we're getting ourselves we're going too far, and we're never going to find somebody to help us. While independence is certainly important in those investigations as well, the complainant, the person who is the victim, or is the person that complains about, is usually the victim. They're still around to make their case and file a civil suit later if they want. That seems to be the national pastime. So I don't recommend doing that. I think we're going to have enough trouble finding a partner without adding, there's going to be a lot more of excessive force complaints, obviously, and there are going to be, hopefully, officer-involved deaths.
Do you know the number?
I don't know the number. Maybe the police department maybe has some idea of the number of complaints they've had recently.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I would tell you it's probably between 20 and 50 somewhere.
20, 50 a year, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yes,
Much greater
Complaints,
number than
yeah.
officer-involved death.
Oh, yeah.
correct. Oh, well, no, officer-involved deaths, we average 1 or 2 a year.
Right, there's a lot of people paying attention. Right, great.
Go ahead.
Just when you're done, when everyone's done, I'd love to ask something.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Well, just a comment. I do agree with the practical reality of we have a heavy lift here to begin with. I do think that as we establish that agreement, it would be worth revisiting this particular point, because once we have the infrastructure in place, then many of the same mechanisms, I assume, would also be used. So I'm open to, at a later phase, looking at this, but agree with right now focusing on the merits of the bill as it's currently written.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the other things we looked at in addition to this excessive force was whether the department had a definition, and we weren't really able to get the answer to this. Maybe you can answer it for me, Chief, of serious bodily injury. I know it's defined in statute. It's like in tort law, if for assault, for example. But do you all track, for example, Mr. Katz mentioned if someone has an interaction, a use of force, that interaction with a police officer, and they break a limb, for example, or hit their head or whatever it is. They're not killed, but they have a serious bodily injury. Do you all track whether that happens, or how many of those happen?
You talking about serious bodily injuries
Yes.
that
In the
involved in a
context of
use of force complaint?
Yes.
We have that information. I mean, we just have to go through each investigation and we could, because an important part of the investigation is what is the injury involved. So that's all part of the investigation. So we could get that information in terms of whether it required medical treatment, a trip to the hospital, medical treatment, treated and released, admitted to the hospital. All those things are incorporated in the investigations. We have all that information.
Well, it may be to Councilmember Albanizer's point. We had made some requests through your office, I think, Assistant Chief Jones, and so maybe it was just all in different places, but that's something we were trying to assess of how many, 1 to 2 deaths a year, but how many use of force interactions resulted in serious bodily injury. So it sounds like you're saying you could get that number. That's something that could come back to us.
Yes, we would just have to go through the use of force complaints for a particular year and to look at the injury involved. And the number would be fairly small. I mean, if you're talking serious bodily injury, because those would clearly always bubble up to my level if we had someone who was taken to the hospital or had a broken limb or something. The ones that mentioned earlier where someone complains that the handcuffs were on too tight or something, they may or may not. I mean, I get a briefing every week from the Internal Affairs Division on all the complaints, no matter what they are. But in terms of follow-up and the ones that would involve serious bodily injury would I would continue to get briefed on the entire case, and so the number's fairly small.
Well, thank you. I think that would be helpful.
Okay. All right, so we're going to move on from number 3. And everybody's okay with what we just discussed? Okay. Should, number 4 is, should the written report be made public after the conclusion of a criminal case? Well, the written, if it's a criminal case, that would be public anyhow, right?
That's correct. A criminal investigation is public information. That's correct.
So this would say that if no criminal charges were filed, would there be a written report from the other agency, I guess, that explained why they felt that the criminal charges were not filed? Like, for example, in the Robert White killing. Is that, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think that was the source of a lot of frustration by the public, is that the decision made by the Howard County State's Attorney did not expand on how they came to that conclusion, what they looked at. I think that in the work that's being done currently between Montgomery County and the Howard County State's Attorney, you're going to find that they are going to talk more about the steps taken, the facts gathered, analysis of the evidence, legal reasoning, and that. Now, I don't know, because I don't know whether that report will be public or not, but I do know that they have instructed that their agreement would be that information would be provided, because I think that a lot of folks found it very frustrating that it said that, you know, shooting is lawful and justified, but does not explain why or how they came to that conclusion.
I have no problem with this, especially because the way, Bob, you're suggesting that it being written, it says to the public to the extent permitted by law. I mean, if there's information in there that is not permitted to you know, for whatever reason, then you know, that's another issue. But I have no problem with this one. Go ahead, please. Were you gonna? No?
I mean, this amendment would just add that after the conclusion of a criminal case against the police officer, the report would then become public. Maybe it already is. I'm not sure. Tell you the truth. Again, it would be to the extent permitted by law. We can't change the Public Information Act, but if it was discretionary to withhold it, it would no longer be discretionary to withhold it. I assume that during, you know, as when criminal charges are being brought, they're not going to necessarily release the report. It'll be released to the defendant. Maybe we can get more
Ed, did you have
information from
something
the
to
county
add to
attorney's
this?
office.
I was just getting bored. Sorry, no, it's Ed Latner, County Attorney's Office. Just to make you aware of something, so we're talking about the Public Information Act, and there's investigatory records, which is what we're talking about here, is in the discretionary category, where the custodian has discretion whether or not to release. So if you're talking about removing the discretion, that's fine. You could do that in terms of, I guess, a county law, removing the discretion that the custodian would have under state law. Just be aware some of the things, some of those reasons that you can exercise discretion to withhold include things like revealing a confidential source, revealing an investigative technique. So I don't know that you want to blanket remove, or just be aware that you would be blanketly removing those discretionary options, and I'm not sure if that's what you want to do.
Well, to me, when you're saying the extent permitted by law would actually be that if there was a confidential source or whatever, that you don't want to put somebody in harm's way by doing this. So, and just like for body-worn camera releases, if it's a juvenile, if it's whatever, they block that person's face out, or if it's somebody who's a confidential informant. So, to me, if we could write that says beyond extent permitted by law, but what is also practical, I mean, as I say, I don't want to put somebody in harm. I think that would take care of some of this. I don't know if anybody else is there.
If I could.
Yeah, please.
I'm kind of confused as to who's issuing the report. I believe in a lot of other states, the state's attorney issues their own report. I think that it might be beneficial for the state's attorney to give reason why they're not prosecuting, and they chose not to prosecute, versus a police department report being released. there's more information there than it would be in a state's attorney issuing a report which they write, in which they come up with as to the reasons why they chose not to go forward with it. I think that's most of what the public wants to hear is why, not the gory details of an investigation, but specifically what were the reasons that the state's attorney's office or the group of investigators that were investigating the event chose not to move forward with it.
And under this, I'm asking Bob, but under this discussion, under this legislation, is the state's attorney involved in this legislation that we're looking at, or is it beyond that?
Well, it depends.
Well, thank you, Bob, for clearing that up.
Yeah, thanks. You're welcome. You know, if in fact the bill is amended to permit a state's attorney's office to provide, I think if we get to the last issue, whether the two investigators are conducting the investigation or simply leading the investigation with the, you know, with the assistance of the county police department. If we get into leading, that was my suggestion to try and make this a little more workable. Then maybe the state's attorney in Howard County can be leading the investigation performed by the county police department. In that case, then you would be talking about a report written by a state's attorney. But I think the way the bill is introduced, it talks about a police department providing a written report to the state's attorney, and that's the report that gets released, not the state's attorney's report. So we are not talking about the state's attorney's report being released. And Mr. Latner did bring up a good point. That is one of the discretionary reasons for withholding an internal memorandum that's otherwise a public information, is if it's an investigatory report of an ongoing investigation, and usually the reason for doing that is to protect confidential sources or to protect the investigation, I guess, if it's still ongoing.
But couldn't that information be redacted? I mean,
Yeah, I guess, but what Mr. Latner's point is, if it's discretionary with the custodian, which would be the police department, and you're saying under county law, you have to release it, you've kind of taken away the discretion that the police department would have to say, no, we can't release this because it's going to identify a confidential source that'll put that person in danger, so I'm not going to release it. You're taking away that discretion so it is permitted to release, the police department can release an investigatory report, but they also have the discretion not to. If the county law says you must release it, it's the council saying to the police department, no discretion, you have to release it. So I don't know that they can redact it if you take this language.
all right, Councilmember Joando, and then Assistant Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think this is an important point, and if it's okay, Tony Holness from the ACLU of Maryland is here. Could she come up on this MPIA point? And while she's making her way up, I think people do want the details. When you talk to Robert White's family, and I've spoken to several members, the justifications that have been given in the case of his death are not sufficient. They don't understand. And other members of the public. And so I do think it is important, and the intention here is that the investigative report is made public. Obviously, if there's a confidential source, and I think that, maybe you could put in, there's maybe one or two enumerated reasons that you could eliminate the discretion, but say, except in these cases, that would maintain, and that would be one that would make sense. But I do think it's important. I think this council supported a bill at the state level to make changes to the MPIA that would remove this discretion statewide. And so I don't know if, Tony, you wanted to comment on that?
First off, thank you for being here.
In Annapolis, they don't give you the the choice to turn your mic on.
They shut you off.
It's not part of the law school learning. Go ahead, please. Yeah, there you go.
Good morning, council members. My name is Tony Holness. I'm the Public Policy Director for the ACLU of Maryland. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you to Councilman Joando for introducing this important legislation. I do think it's important to get some clarity on exactly what the PIA requires and does not require. So as committee counsel mentioned, if an investigation is pending, the custodian has very broad discretion to deny disclosure of the records, and that's for all the public interest reasons that were discussed earlier, because there's a fear of compromising an investigation if too much information is disclosed. Now, once the investigation has ended, the custodian may rely on 7 specific bases for denying the records. And I'm going to list them. It's a little boring, but I think it's helpful to understand, all that's been considered under the state law. So the custodian could deny the inspection of the record if disclosure would interfere with a valid and proper law enforcement proceeding, if it would deprive another person of a right to a fair trial or an impartial proceeding, if disclosure would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy, if the disclosure would disclose the identity of a confidential source or disclose an investigative technique or procedure, if it would prejudice an investigation or endanger the life or physical safety of an individual. So these are all the bases that have thought through, and they're really quite comprehensive. So I would discourage the council from carving out more exceptions, because it seems like all of that has been contemplated by the Public Information Act. Now, to the point Councilmember Joando made earlier, this body has supported HB 413 and SB 979, which was introduced and have not made it through crossover as of yet. And those bills would have moved the personnel records from the mandatory non-disclosure part of the Public Information Act to the discretionary public section of the PIA. So it does seem to me that a policy decision has already been made by this body to allow for greater transparency than what's already allowed for under state law.
And I think, to be clear, I don't think anyone was suggesting that we add anything. We were suggesting having things that are on that list that would be included, that there would be a reason why you wouldn't allow that part of the report to be shown. I mean, I think there's good, valid reasons that you're concerned about somebody's safety, that, or whatever. Here's someone's coming forward and being a good, a good citizen, and you don't want them to be harmed in any way. So I'm fine if we, I guess the only concern is about the personnel record. And I don't know how that works with, and maybe the FOP has a comment on that, but
Well, right now, under law, any disciplinary record is a personnel record. So this would affect a disciplinary record, because remember, we're only talking about the criminal investigation at this point. There are 2 investigations. So the criminal investigation goes first, and then the administrative investigation goes second. And the reason the criminal investigation goes first is because it's criminal.
Sure.
And the administrative investigation is a job action. So I think it's important to remember that this person, whoever gets involved in a shooting or a serious bodily injury, is exposed. Their personal record will be exposed, and it depends on the outcome. So if it's a criminal investigation and they do prosecute, and whatever the outcome, then that record is open. I mean, it's there. But if it's not if the criminal investigation does not go forward, then the record is not open to the public.
But I guess what I'm asking, if it doesn't get into the personnel record, I mean, if it's strictly about the criminal, why someone was not charged, or why, if someone is, that becomes open anyhow. So would there be an opposition, do you believe there would be an opposition if it's strictly from the criminal, not from the personnel side?
It just depends on what information is contained in the record, and it depends on the type of investigation, what's being done. It depends from department to department what they include in these investigations. So I couldn't tell you right now, unless I saw one from Howard County or Prince George's County.
Okay. And Chief, please.
Yes, sir. So to President Cook's point, you know, what is in the body of the report would obviously be concerning to us. You know, the list is limited in terms of exceptions for discretion, but in their investigative techniques, the potential to compromise another investigation, those are things that I would just say tread cautiously, because these cases, you don't know what they're going to look like in the future, and you don't know what they can touch. We have a very limited, finite playbook, and obviously we have concerns about being able to execute an investigation properly using the lawful techniques that we're allowed to utilize.
Go ahead.
And thank you, everybody, for chiming in, and thank you, Ms. Holness. You don't leave, but I just thank you for that. I think enumerating the exceptions that would still be in place under this bill and under the amendment, I think that's a wide list, and I'm in favor of this amendment to just clarify that we want the report to be made public if or if not criminal charges are filed at the conclusion of that. And I think that list of exceptions would still be in place, and I think it's, you know, I just wanted to make sure I was clear on where I was.
And I think we have to be clear that this is talking about the criminal case, not about personnel or anything else at that point. Yeah.
I think we'd have to be clear, I think we'd have to actually list those seven,
Then I have
you know,
no,
those seven reasons in this law.
Or we could just say subject to the, or in accordance with the MPIA, and it just rides along with the
okay, because if
PIA.
they go down to 6 or go up to 9, we're not going to change our law each time. I mean, you know.
All right, we can, so, just so I understand it, so we would amend the bill as provided in page 4 of the packet, but change it to say,
To the extent allowed by the MPIA.
Well, to the extent permitted by law, right?
Oh, okay, I thought we were.
well, well, no, what Mr. Latner was saying, it must be released to the public in accordance with the MPIA.
Well, but
You know,
isn't it
even if
also
you
the
said-
extent permitted by law?
Even if you said nothing, it is a public record, subject to the Public Information Act. So even if this was silent, we would still have to deal with requests in accordance with the PIA. So you could have nothing in there about it, but if you want to have something, I guess it could be released in accordance with the PIA.
Okay. I'm fine with that. And candidly, I do believe we should have something in here, because I don't want somebody to say, see, they said that, but then they really didn't mean that. I think we need to be transparent on this piece of legislation as well, as best we can. Is everybody okay with that? Yes, okay. All right, so next is number 5, which should the bill better describe the type of experience the independent investigators must possess? And Bob's suggestion is who have significant experience and expertise in conducting homicide and law enforcement officers' use of force investigations, and.
I believe that's a little clearer as to what type of expertise you're looking for, because complex criminal investigations, investigating consumer fraud can be complex and could be a criminal investigation, and that's not what we're looking for. I think that's closer to the kind of training and personnel that the police department would send out for this type of investigation, but I'm happy to hear differences of opinion on that from the police department. But I think it's a better, it's a more complete statement than simply complex criminal investigations.
I'm fine with that. Everybody's okay with that? Good. All right, number 6. How would an investigation of officer-involved death be handled under this bill? And then go ahead. One of these suggestions, Bob's suggestion, is the independent investigation must be led by at least 2 independent investigators. Let me ask you this. If a person is shot and our police officers were able to save that person's life on the scene, and the person goes to wherever they're going, to the hospital, shock trauma, wherever they go, would the way this bill is written, would the person was shot but not killed, the investigation itself would not be done by an outside agency because that person is still living. Is that correct? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, if the person died 3 days later, then it would be subject to the bill, but if the person survives, it wouldn't be an officer-involved death. That's right.
All right, so at that point, our officers are on the scene, and you call supervisors in and, do all the things that you need to be doing properly. That investigation would have been handled up to that point by Montgomery County. The ballistics, whatever, the forensics and everything else associated with it. So my concern again is that it be clear that our officers need to do their job, need to keep the public safe and themselves safe, and that they have not violated this piece of legislation by doing their job this way. I think it has to be clear that, and maybe it's clear right now, but that's one of my concerns about this, the way that this could be construed.
Well, there's a definition of officer-involved death. It means the death of an individual resulting from an action by a police officer or when the individual is in police custody. Again, it would be the person, if the person doesn't die on the scene and he's transported to a hospital, this bill wouldn't apply unless the person ultimately passed.
Okay.
That's
You're
the way
fine.
I read it. So I think in any event, we certainly don't want to stop the police department that are on the scene, including the police officer that fired the gun, to provide first aid and assistance to the victim. I hope we're not doing that.
No, I don't believe I know that's not our intent.
And
but I
that
don't
kind
want
of goes
anybody
to, it goes to, I guess, the paragraphs that I suggested in the packet. It seems, in at least my limited understanding of what happens and more that I've heard today from the chief, in an investigation like this, we're talking about large numbers of investigators who have different jobs responding to the scene, and that it's impractical to expect the police, our police department to just put a yellow tape around the scene and walk away and wait for another police department to bring in all those people. And that really, what we're really looking for is who's in charge of the investigation, and that would provide your independence. And so my suggestion would be to change this to 2 investigators to lead the investigation, coming from another department, they would be using the county police, who have the resources to provide provide evidence and, controlling the scene, collecting evidence, finding witnesses on the spot, and all the other things that you heard the chief describe that happens in this area, ultimately under the supervision of 2 independent investigators coming from another department, who would have the discretion to say, no, this wasn't enough, go talk to that person again, or let me talk to that person, and let me see, you need to do more forensic evidence, whatever it is that a lead person might do, that in an attempt to actually find somebody, if you could, enter into an agreement with another organization that says, look, we're not expecting you to send 12 people to the scene, we're expecting you to send 2 people to supervise the county police, is probably more workable and still gets you a little further. I think, as we all agree, maybe the best would be if there was a state, department with the resources to send 12 people there and send it to whatever they had to do. But even in Wisconsin, you can see where there is a state agency, the involved police department still has a role to assist, and that it's really, what we're really worried about is leading, and that's why I suggested the amendments that are on pages 5 and 6 of the packet, to talk about, and in fact, in my mind, I suppose the Howard County State's Attorney's Office may be the two lead investigators, I suppose. Although I'm not, I guess, would they be considered sworn investigators? Yeah. That I guess that could be done, as Assistant Chief Anderson pointed out, that in investigations that are done just by us, by the county, there's often state's attorneys, prosecutors that actually lead the investigation. The police do the initial work and provide evidence, but the actual leading of the investigation of whether we need further evidence and analysis is done by the state's attorney's office as well. So that was my attempt to try and make the bill a little more workable, and I think it keeps in line with some independence. I think the people that are leading the investigation, is something you could point to for independence. I know it's not, complete independence would be better if nobody who touches the evidence and collects the evidence and talks to any witnesses is involved in the county, is a county police officer, but I don't think it's practicable.
Okay.
And I don't think it'll work. And I think there's too many people, resources that are necessary. So
Okay.
that's the point I was making.
Thank you. Will, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I strongly recommend we reject these proposed amendments. The whole point of the independence in this minimum threshold is exactly that, a minimum threshold, that at least 2 independent investigators, now that we've changed that to sworn, be involved. If we set up the agreement, I'm a positive thinker that we're going to have a good agreement with somebody. They might want to bring more people. They might want to use their crime lab. They might. I don't think we should be interfering with anything that could be set up in the MOU. And the word performed versus led, I think we want to be sending the message that the primary investigators here are the outside entity, and so I don't think we should be changing that language, and I also don't think it precludes any of the other things that are discussed in the Wisconsin report, that there's acknowledging that there will be some involvement from our department, because they're there when it happens. And so I think this actually muddies the water of the actual intent of the bill, and I don't think it provides any additional help. We want to say this is a minimum of 2 investigators. We don't want to get in the way of the MOU, and they should be performing the investigation. If they choose to utilize our police as involved in that, this does not preclude them from doing so. But I don't think we need to lay it out in this way. And actually, I think by doing so, it actually gets at the core independence of the bill, which is the goal.
Right. But to your point, we're saying the independent investigation must be performed by at least 2 independent investigators. But I guess we need to be clear with what you just said, and that is that if those independent investigators need Montgomery County Police to be involved, that they can be involved. And I guess to that point, I think that should be added in an air bill, that the independent investigator, not everybody has to be independent, as long as the independent investigators are fine, that not everybody's independent. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Will, but I think that's basically what you just said.
Well, yeah, I'm saying that I think as it's currently written, it doesn't preclude them from utilizing the host police agency. So, if the committee obviously feels that they want to go in that direction, stating what can already happen, but I think it's that performed versus led is a important point, and I think by saying the way it's being discussed by Mr. Drummer, it says like there's 2 people that come out and kind of oversee, and it might be more than that,
Right, sure,
and so I don't want us seem to be saying that we just send 2 people out and that's it, and so that's my concern with the change. And I think what you described is currently allowed under the current language.
Right, but I just think, go ahead, anybody else on this? I just believe that we should be clear that it doesn't just have to be, it's not an exclusive for the outside agency if they request,
Just add a sentence saying Montgomery County Police.
Well, that's on, I think if you don't change perform to lead, but leave in what's on page 6 is this section must not be interpreted to prohibit the department from providing support and assistance to the independent investigators leading the investigation, or you could say that, I could say performing the investigation. I mean, I've already, the sentence is already there, it's on page 6, it's not in the bill. It's-
Performing,
We could say performing and take out leading and write performing in both instances.
that's fine.
I think that would do what you're talking about.
I'm fine with that, are you? And then the only other thing, and I know that we're getting close to an hour, to the 11:30 here, but for E subsection 1, it says an internal administrative review of the incident by the department. And I know the department is, by definition, in this piece of legislation, that when we call the word department, it becomes Montgomery County's Police Department. But I would think that we would want to put the words Montgomery County for the department, by the Montgomery County Department, and then for subsection, for 2, and that same thing under E, the Montgomery County Department, again, for providing support. I don't want someone who's reading this to get confused that the department is the Howard County Department, or whoever. I keep saying Howard County, might not be Howard County, but the outside agency. It doesn't change a thing, it just makes it clearer to me, so.
Sure, we could do that.
Okay, anybody else on this piece of legislation? Go ahead. No, you're
I
good.
just want to thank the committee for their careful consideration. I want to thank our police and our union and everyone else for being here, so thank you.
I was going to do the same for that. But I do know that we're going to have to come back. Somehow, I don't think Bob could write all this stuff today, so I would like to, if possible, come back as soon as we can. I mean, we want to get this done. We want to have our county executive begin to work on trying to figure out who might and how it might work, and so the sooner we can do it, the better. But you have to give it time in order for you to do your job as well.
I just wanted to make one more, a slight correction in the packet, just, it doesn't require a change in the bill, but I think the top of page 2, I said that the independent investigation required by the bill must not be used as a basis for discipline of the officer. That's not really true, it's not in the bill. The independent investigation would be an administrative investigation by internal affairs is separate. That's what the bill talks about, that this doesn't affect that. But whether or not the internal investigation relies on the criminal charges or the criminal investigation, I believe they sometimes do. And there's nothing in the bill that precludes it. It was just a misstatement by me describing the bill.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here. This was, I think we've gotten ourselves further down the line here to get this done. We are adjourned.